"You're not alone anymore," Cowboy whispered when he found a wounded native woman in the woods. Jake Cooper had spent the last several days riding across the wide expanse of the rugged American West. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills, thick forests, and towering mountains, all seeming to whisper the secrets of a world that hadn't changed in centuries. Jake was used to the solitude. He had always preferred the company of his horses over people, the quiet of the open wilderness more comforting than the noise of a crowded town. The air was fresh and cool as Jake pushed his horse onward, the steady rhythm of hooves a familiar comfort. He'd been traveling for hours, heading home to his small cabin, nestled deep in the woods. The journey had been long, and he could feel the weight of exhaustion beginning to settle in his bones. It wasn't often that he ventured so far from his land, but sometimes the open road called to him, a reminder of the life he had chosen, far from the bustle of town and the complexities of society. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as Jake slowed his horse to a gentle trot. He scanned the horizon, appreciating the peaceful beauty of the evening. It was moments like this that made him feel most at peace, just him and the world, with nothing else to worry about. But as he neared a dense thicket of trees, a strange sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost like the wind howling through the branches. But as Jake listened more closely, it became clearer, a soft, muffled cry, almost too quiet to be real. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately stopped his horse. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice rough and low. The sound had stopped, but the air felt different now, charged with the sense that something wasn't quite right. Jake dismounted, tethering his horse to a nearby tree. He walked cautiously into the thicket, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back, but he kept it lowered. He wasn't expecting trouble, at least not the kind that might come from people. Most of the trouble in these woods came from wildlife, and Jake had learned to live with that. As he moved deeper into the forest, he heard it again, a soft, painful moan. It was coming from up ahead. Jake's pulse quickened. Without thinking, he quickened his pace, pushing aside branches and vines as he navigated through the thick underbrush. The sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade away, replaced by the steady beat of his heart. Then he saw her, lying motionless on the ground beneath a large oak tree. There was a woman, her face bruised and bloodied, her clothes torn and dirty. She was covered in dirt and blood, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, as if she had been thrown there carelessly. She was breathing, but barely. Her eyes were closed, and her mouth was slightly open in pain. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to do. He had never seen anything like this before. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. How had she gotten here? What had happened to her? Why was she alone in the woods, wounded and vulnerable? He knelt down beside her, carefully placing his hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her body stiffened slightly under his touch. He had to act fast. "Hey, miss, can you hear me?" Jake's voice was gentle but firm. He needed her to respond. She was alive, but for how long? He checked for any signs of consciousness, but she didn't stir. The blood on her side was a deep red, and the stain was spreading quickly. She had been wounded badly. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do next. His cabin was a few miles away, but it was the only place he could think of where he could properly care for her. There was no way he could leave her here, in the woods. She was barely holding on as it was. Without a second thought, Jake gently lifted the woman into his arms, cradling her carefully against his chest. She felt so small and fragile in his arms. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and how she had ended up in this condition. He couldn't just leave her like this, no matter who she was or what had happened. She needed help, and that was all that mattered. Carrying her was harder than he expected. His legs burned from the effort, and his arms felt heavy, but he didn't dare stop. He needed to get her to safety. He had been alone most of his life, and he was used to handling things on his own. But this was different. He had never been responsible for someone else before. The sun had nearly set by the time Jake reached his cabin. He had to stop and catch his breath a few times along the way, but somehow he made it. His cabin was small and simple, tucked away in a secluded part of the forest. The walls were weathered from years of exposure to the elements, but it was sturdy. It was a place where Jake could escape from the world, a place that had always felt like home to him. But now, it felt more like a refuge for someone else. Jake laid the woman down gently on his small cot by the fire, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to remove the bloodied clothes from her wound. The gash on her side was deep, and there was no way to tell how long she had been out here, bleeding and alone. He needed to stop the bleeding, but he wasn't sure he had the right supplies for something like this. But he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. He had made a promise to himself a long time ago to never leave someone behind. That promise was the only thing that kept him going now. He worked quickly, tearing strips of cloth to bind her wound, trying his best to clean it with the limited resources he had. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know the first thing about healing wounds, but he knew how to take care of things in a practical way. His hands were steady, even as he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no idea who this woman was, or what kind of danger he might be bringing into his life by helping her. But for now, he had to focus on keeping her alive. As the fire crackled in the background, Jake sat beside her, watching over her. He didn't speak much, not knowing what to say. His mind was filled with questions that seemed impossible to answer. Who had done this to her? Why had she been left to die alone in the woods? The woman's breathing was shallow, and for a while, Jake wasn't sure if she would survive the night. But he stayed with her, never leaving her side. As the hours passed, he finally allowed himself to rest, sitting in a chair nearby, his eyes never straying far from her face. It wasn't long before she stirred. Jake was startled when she opened her eyes, her gaze unfocused at first, as if she was still lost in some distant place. "You're safe now," Jake whispered, unsure if she could hear him. "You're not alone anymore." The woman's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Jake watched her carefully, unsure of how to communicate with someone who was clearly so far from home. But as she slowly regained her strength, she turned her head toward him and tried to speak, though her voice was hoarse. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated, unsure how to answer, but after a moment he spoke softly. "I'm Jake. I found you in the woods. You've been hurt, but you're safe now." The woman blinked, still processing his words. Her eyes were full of confusion and fear, but also a flicker of hope. For the first time since he found her, Jake saw a faint trace of recognition in her gaze. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added, though he wasn't sure if she believed him yet. She nodded slowly, still unsure of her surroundings, but something in her expression softened. She was exhausted, and Jake could see the pain still clouding her eyes. But for now she was alive, and that was enough. Days passed, and the woman whom Jake had come to call Kaya began to show signs of recovery. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jake hope. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin as he sat beside her, watching her sleep. Her face, once pale and strained with pain, had begun to regain some color. She still winced when she moved, but her breathing was more even, and her temperature had finally returned to normal. Jake had always been a man of action. His life on the ranch had taught him how to survive, how to care for himself and his animals. But this was different. Caring for Kaya was unfamiliar territory, and the longer she stayed, the more Jake wondered about her past. Where had she come from? Why had she been left to die in the woods? There were so many questions, yet every time he thought about asking, he stopped himself. She wasn't ready to talk, and Jake didn't want to push her. For now, his priority was making sure she had enough to eat and drink, keeping her as comfortable as possible. His small cabin didn't have much in the way of modern comforts, but it had warmth, a bed, and food. Jake had never been one for fancy things. His cabin had always been just a place to sleep after a long day of work. But now, with Kaya recovering on his cot, it felt like something more. It felt like a sanctuary, and he wasn't about to let anything threaten that. Kaya's wounds had been tended to, but it was clear that her recovery would take time. Jake had done his best to clean and dress the gash on her side, but he knew it wasn't perfect. He wasn't a doctor, and he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more he could have done. Still, it was better than leaving her out there to die, and the more she healed, the more she seemed to trust him. She started speaking more, though her voice remained weak and strained. At first her words had been few, mostly murmurs or unintelligible whispers. But now she would ask for water, and sometimes she would talk to him in a soft, almost hesitant voice. Her English wasn't perfect, but Jake could understand most of what she said. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's small window, Jake stood by the stove preparing a simple breakfast. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and bread. Kaya stirred on the cot behind him, her eyes blinking slowly as she woke up. Jake heard her small groan, a sound that broke the silence of the cabin. He turned to look at her, offering a quiet smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and easy. Kaya's eyes met his, and for the first time since he'd found her, Jake saw a flicker of recognition. She wasn't just looking at him like some stranger anymore. There was something softer in her gaze, a glimmer of understanding. It made his heart tighten, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Morning," Kaya replied, her voice raspier than usual. She slowly shifted her position on the cot, wincing as she moved. Jake noticed the way she tried to hide the pain, but it was there. He could see it in the way she clenched her jaw. "I'll make you something to eat," Jake said, turning back to the stove. "You need your strength." Kaya didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, her eyes tracing his movements as he worked. Jake could feel her gaze, but he didn't mind. He was used to the quiet. He hadn't expected her to talk much anyway. She had been through a lot. He knew that. The silence in the cabin wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. Jake wasn't one for conversation, and Kaya seemed content to rest. But every so often she would glance up at him, and Jake couldn't help but feel a deep curiosity about her. She was clearly different from anyone he had ever met. There was something about her presence, something strong, yet fragile at the same time. He set the food on the small table next to the cot, then stepped back. Kaya slowly sat up, her body trembling slightly as she pushed herself upright. She took a deep breath, and though she was clearly in pain, there was something determined in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her words soft but sincere. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving thanks, especially not from someone like Kaya. She had been through so much, and yet she was still here. She hadn't given up, even when things seemed hopeless. Jake admired that strength in her, though he wasn't sure if she saw it in herself. As she ate, Jake sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the forest beyond. His thoughts drifted, his mind restless. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman sitting across from him. Kaya was quiet, but there was something about her that pulled him in. There was a sadness in her eyes, one that seemed to speak of a past filled with pain. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a light that hadn't been extinguished even after everything she had endured. Kaya finished her meal slowly, eating what she could. Jake watched her quietly, noticing how she winced every time she shifted her position. The injury to her side still bothered her, though it seemed less severe now. The bandages were starting to stain again, but they weren't soaked through. Jake stood up and moved toward her, reaching for the clean cloths he had prepared the night before. Kaya stiffened slightly, but he didn't miss the way she subtly relaxed once he began tending to her wound. She was used to being cared for in this way, it seemed. Maybe not by him, but at least she wasn't completely frightened anymore. "There," Jake said, adjusting the bandage. "You should rest more today." Kaya nodded, though her eyes looked distant. She was tired, no doubt. But she also looked like she was thinking, as if she was deciding whether or not to share something with him. Jake wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about her past yet, but he knew it would come in time. For now, he was content to let her recover at her own pace. "I'll go out later, get some fresh firewood," Jake said, trying to break the silence. "You'll be okay here?" Kaya's eyes flickered up at him, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something. But then she hesitated, and her shoulders slumped. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply nodded, closing her eyes again as she leaned back against the pillows. Jake wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could tell she had a lot on her mind. Maybe, just maybe, she'd open up to him one day. For now, all he could do was let her know she was safe. He couldn't change her past, but he could give her a chance to heal, to find some peace. As Jake left the cabin to gather firewood, he glanced back at the small window, where Kaya still rested. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for her to feel safe again. How long it would take for her to trust him completely. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't let her face this world alone. He had made a promise to himself when he found her in the woods, and he wasn't about to break it. She wasn't alone anymore, and as long as Jake had a say in it, she never would be again. Over the next few days, Jake noticed a subtle but important shift in Kaya. She was still recovering, her body healing at its own pace, but there was something different in the way she moved now. She wasn't just lying in bed anymore, staring blankly at the ceiling. Instead, she began to sit up more often, shifting her position carefully so as not to strain her side. She asked questions about the world outside the cabin, about the animals Jake cared for, and the trees in the woods that stretched out in every direction. Jake found himself telling her about his life, the way he'd grown up in the open plains, tending to cattle, learning the land, and how he had found peace in the quiet of nature. At first, it had been difficult for him to speak about himself. He wasn't used to sharing personal details, but there was something about Kaya that made him want to talk, want to connect. Her quiet listening, the way she looked at him with those thoughtful eyes, made him feel understood, even though their worlds were so different. One evening, after Jake had come back from gathering firewood, he found Kaya standing near the window, gazing out at the setting sun. Her movements were slower than usual, but there was a grace to the way she stood, a quiet strength that Jake had begun to admire. She hadn't asked for help, but Jake could see that she was still struggling. Her face was drawn with the effort of keeping herself steady, but her expression was more peaceful than it had been in days. "You okay?" Jake asked softly, setting down the firewood by the stove. Kaya turned her head to look at him. Her expression was neutral, but there was a glint in her eyes that suggested she wanted to say something. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been before. "I'm getting better," she said, her words slow but sure. "I haven't been able to walk for a long time." Jake nodded, understanding. He had noticed that Kaya hadn't tried to stand much at first, perhaps afraid of what it would do to her injured side. But now, she was pushing herself. There was a determination in her, an unspoken refusal to stay down. Jake admired that, though he worried she might be rushing things. He knew it would take time for her body to fully heal, but he didn't want to stop her. Sometimes, when people tried to heal too quickly, it could make things worse, but he respected Kaya's spirit. She was resilient, no matter how much pain she might have been in. "You need to take it easy," Jake said, his tone gentle but firm. "It'll take time for everything to heal, but you're getting stronger." Kaya didn't reply immediately. She just looked at him, her gaze steady. There was something almost unreadable in her eyes. For a moment it felt like the air between them thickened, as if she were weighing something inside her. Then, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Why did you help me?" Jake wasn't prepared for the question. He blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. He had been so focused on making sure she was okay, on helping her heal, that he hadn't thought much about why he had done it. It was just something he had to do. But now, with Kaya looking at him with those curious, questioning eyes, he realized that it wasn't something he could easily explain. "Because—" "You needed help," he said after a moment, shrugging his shoulders slightly. "I couldn't leave you out there. I'm not sure why I was the one to find you, but I was. And I don't leave people to suffer if I can do something about it." Kaya seemed to consider his words carefully. She was silent for a while, and Jake waited, not wanting to push her for more than she was willing to share. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I don't know if I could have trusted anyone else," she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But you didn't hurt me. You helped me. Jake didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't often that people expressed their gratitude so openly, especially not when they were still dealing with the weight of fear and trauma.
Kaya had been through something terrible, and she had every right to be wary of the world.
The fact that she had come to trust him, even a little, was something Jake didn't take lightly. "I'm glad you're starting to trust me," Jake said simply, his words quiet but sincere. "It's not easy, I know, but you're safe here. I promise." Kaya's eyes softened, though she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned back to the window, her gaze lost in the fading light outside. Jake stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. There was still so much he didn't know about her past, about the life she had left behind. But he didn't press her for answers. She would talk when she was ready, and until then, he would be there, offering what he could: his shelter, his protection, and most of all, his presence. Over the next few days, Kaya's strength continued to improve. She began to walk with more confidence, though she still leaned on the walls for support at times. Jake was always there, watching from a distance, making sure she didn't overdo it. He could see the frustration in her eyes when she struggled to move freely, but he didn't push her to hurry. The last thing he wanted was for her to end up back in bed, because she had tried to move too fast. One afternoon, Jake came back to the cabin after a long day of checking on the animals. As he stepped inside, he saw Kaya sitting by the fire, her hands resting on her lap. She had a distant look in her eyes, as if she were lost in thought. "Hey," Jake said gently, stepping closer to her. "How's the leg?" Kaya didn't look at him right away, but after a moment she met his gaze, her expression soft but guarded. "It's better," she said, though her tone was quieter than usual. "I've been thinking." Jake waited, allowing her to find the words she needed. He had a feeling she was about to open up in a way she hadn't before. And as always, he was ready to listen.
"About what?" Jake asked, lowering himself to sit across from her by the fire.
Kaya hesitated for a moment, then looked down at her hands, as if searching for the right words. "About where I'm from. About the things I've lost." Jake didn't push her to explain more. He simply nodded, letting her take her time. "I came from a small village," Kaya continued after a pause. "We lived simply in harmony with the land, but everything changed when they came. The people who don't understand us, they don't see us as human." Jake's heart tightened as he listened. He had heard stories of such things, of raids and violence, of entire communities torn apart. But to hear it from Kaya, to hear the pain in her voice, made it real in a way that nothing else had. He could see that she was carrying a heavy burden, one she had been forced to bear alone for so long.
"I'm sorry," Jake said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to."
"But you're not alone anymore, Kaya. You don't have to carry this on your own." Kaya didn't say anything, but for the first time since he had met her, Jake saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, just a small spark. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. The days grew warmer as the spring season settled in, the trees around Jake's cabin beginning to bloom with new life. The sounds of the forest had changed too. Birds chirped more brightly, and the rustling of leaves in the wind seemed to carry a different kind of energy, a promise of new beginnings. The cabin was no longer just a place of survival for Jake. It had become a place of quiet refuge, where two people once strangers were beginning to find something that resembled peace. Kaya's recovery was progressing slowly but steadily. Each day she seemed a little stronger, her steps a little more sure. The once agonizing pain in her side was now a dull throb, and she no longer needed to rely on the walls to keep her steady as she moved around. She spent more time by the window, watching the world outside, as though she were starting to reconnect with it again. Every now and then, Jake would catch her gazing at the horizon, her face unreadable, lost in thought. He had noticed how she had started to open up to him more, though she still held certain things close, things that Jake knew were too painful to talk about. But that was okay. He wasn't going anywhere. Jake had made it clear from the beginning that Kaya wasn't alone anymore, and with every passing day she seemed to believe it more. They had fallen into a routine, a peaceful rhythm that had come naturally. In the mornings, Jake would tend to the animals, and Kaya would help where she could, usually with small tasks that didn't strain her. The rest of the day was spent in simple companionship. Sometimes they would talk, sharing stories from their lives, though Kaya still didn't talk much about her past. But Jake didn't mind. He was learning that silence could be just as valuable as words. They didn't need to speak all the time to be understood. One afternoon, Jake returned from a trip into town to gather supplies. His arms were full of bags, and he noticed immediately that Kaya wasn't where she usually was. She wasn't by the window or sitting at the table. He set down the bags and walked into the next room, where he found her standing near the small bookshelf, looking through the few books Jake had. Most of them were simple guides on ranching, some old novels Jake had inherited from his father. Kaya's fingers lingered over the worn covers as she picked up a book and carefully flipped through its pages. "You're quiet today," Jake said softly, not wanting to startle her. Kaya looked up from the book, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She hadn't smiled much, but when she did, it was a small, gentle thing that Jake cherished. "I've never seen so many books before," she said, her voice still soft but tinged with curiosity. "Where did you get them?" Jake walked over and glanced at the book she was holding. It was a worn copy of a classic novel one his father had enjoyed reading. "Just some old things from my father. I never read much," Jake admitted, scratching the back of his head. "I spend most of my time outside, so these were never really for me." Kaya nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the edge of the book's cover. "I used to read sometimes," she said. "When I was younger, my family had a little library. Not like this, but enough to pass the time." She stopped herself, as though realizing how much she had just shared. Jake didn't press her to say more, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with her in that moment. They were both people who had lived in solitude, each for different reasons. They were learning, day by day, how to trust each other and share parts of themselves. "That sounds nice," Jake said after a moment.
If you ever feel like reading, you're welcome to anything here. You can have whichever ones you want." Kaya looked at him, her eyes softer than they had been before.
"Thank you," she replied quietly. She didn't ask for much, but every time she expressed her gratitude, it felt like a small victory to Jake. As the days passed, Kaya began to take on more of the responsibilities around the cabin. She still wasn't fully recovered, but she wanted to contribute. She helped cook the meals when she could, her hands moving carefully as she chopped vegetables or stirred a pot. Jake could see that she wasn't used to being cared for. She had been independent for so long, relying on no one but herself. But she was learning to accept help, and Jake was learning how to give it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cabin in a soft golden light, Jake and Kaya sat together by the fire. They hadn't spoken much that day, but the quiet didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt natural, a peaceful silence that allowed them both to simply exist in the moment. Kaya sat near the fire, her legs tucked under her, while Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Kaya broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's possible to start over?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the fire. Jake didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what she meant exactly, but he had a feeling that she was asking something deeper than the question itself. "I think it depends on what you mean," Jake said slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Starting over. It's not always easy, but sometimes it's the only choice we have. You can't change what happened, but you can change where you go from here." Kaya was quiet for a long time, her eyes still fixed on the fire. Jake could see that she was thinking, contemplating his words. "Where do you think I should go?" she asked after a while, her voice still soft but with a trace of uncertainty. Jake wasn't sure how to answer that. He had never been good at giving advice, and Kaya's question was one he couldn't answer for her. He knew that whatever path she chose, it would be hers to walk. "I don't know," Jake said finally, his voice gentle. "But I know this. Whatever you choose, you don't have to do it alone." Kaya turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything for a moment, but her gaze softened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure if she truly believed it. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew that in this moment, they were not alone. They had both been given a second chance, though it wasn't the kind of second chance either of them had expected. For Jake, it was a chance to help someone in need, to offer something he hadn't known he had in him. And for Kaya, it was a chance to heal, not just physically, but emotionally, to find some peace after the pain she had endured. The fire crackled softly in the background, and for the first time since she had arrived, Kaya seemed at peace. She wasn't looking at the fire with the same distance in her eyes as before. Now there was something more. Hope. Maybe she hadn't given up completely on starting over. Maybe, just maybe, this cabin could be the place where she learned how to believe in a future again. As the firelight flickered in the darkened room, Jake sat quietly, knowing that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone either. He had found something too, not just in helping Kaya, but in the companionship they had begun to share. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The days had become warmer, the night still crisp, but the air was filled with a sense of change. Jake and Kaya had settled into a life together, one that neither had expected, but both had come to appreciate. Their quiet cabin, tucked away from the world, had become more than just a shelter. It had become a place of healing, of new beginnings. And with every passing day, the bond between them grew stronger, more unspoken but still deeply understood. Jake had spent the past few weeks focused on the simple routines of life, tending to the land, caring for the animals, making sure Kaya had everything she needed. But Kaya, too, had found a way to help. She was stronger now, her movements smoother, and more confident. It was as though the longer she stayed, the more she began to believe in the possibility of a future beyond her past. She started helping Jake with the chores, carrying firewood, preparing meals, and even tending to the small vegetable garden outside the cabin. One morning as the sun rose high in the sky, Kaya stood outside, her arms outstretched to welcome the warmth of the day. She had always been a woman who had lived by the land, and now, as the early light touched her skin, she seemed to connect with it again. There was a freedom in the air that she hadn't felt in so long, a lightness that she had almost forgotten was possible. Jake watched her from the doorway, a small smile tugging at his lips. She looked different, not just in the way she stood, but in her whole demeanor. She wasn't the same woman he had found in the woods, broken and barely holding on to life. Now, there was something about her that radiated strength, and it was in the way she moved, the way she held herself. "You look like you belong here," Jake called out from the doorway, his voice gentle but full of sincerity. Kaya turned to him, her face lighting up with a quiet smile. "I think I do," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "I didn't know what it would be like to feel like this again, to be at peace." Jake stepped outside to stand beside her, looking out at the wide expanse of forest before them. "We both needed this," he said quietly. "I didn't know it until you showed up at this cabin. This place is more than just a home. It's where I found a purpose again." Kaya glanced at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But maybe, in a way, you saved yourself too." Jake turned to look at her, surprised by the depth of her words. She was right, though. Before Kaya had arrived, Jake had spent his days in quiet isolation. He had never truly thought about what he was missing, what he was running from. But now, with her here, with the life they had built together, it felt like he had found something he had been searching for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. "Maybe I did," Jake agreed, his voice full of emotion. "I've been living so alone for so long I didn't know what it meant to truly care for someone." Kaya's gaze softened as she looked at him, her expression full of warmth and gratitude. There was no doubt in her eyes anymore, no trace of the fear that had once clouded her thoughts. She had come to trust Jake, not just as a protector but as a companion, as someone who cared for her well-being. She knew that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. In the following days, they worked together to make the cabin feel more like home. Kaya planted herbs around the garden, things she had grown up with in her village. Lavender, thyme, and sage, simple plants but ones that carried meaning. For her, it was a way of taking ownership of her new life, of putting down roots in a place that she had once thought would only be temporary. Every time she worked in the garden, she felt a sense of pride, as though she were slowly reclaiming the parts of herself that had been lost. Jake, in turn, began to let down his own walls. He had always been independent, used to handling everything by himself. But now, with Kaya at his side, he realized that he didn't have to do everything alone. They shared the work, the responsibilities, the small tasks that made up their daily lives. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind them both that they were stronger together than apart. One evening, as they sat by the fire, their bodies weary from a day's work, Kaya spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "Jake," she began, her eyes fixed on the fire, "what do you think would have happened if I hadn't come here? If you hadn't found me that day?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe I would have just kept going, living the same way. Alone. Maybe I would have stopped caring." "Bye." Kaya turned to him, her expression filled with both sadness and understanding. "I would have been alone too," she said quietly. "I would have been lost forever." The weight of her words settled in the space between them. There was so much they hadn't said to each other, so much they both carried from their pasts. But in this moment they didn't need to speak. The connection they had built was enough. "Maybe this is where we were always meant to be," Jake said after a long silence, his voice full of certainty. "Maybe the world works in strange ways." "But I'm glad you're here." Kaya didn't respond right away, but she didn't need to. Her gaze met his, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both been through things they didn't want to relive, but they had come out the other side stronger, and now they had each other. Over the next few weeks, their routine continued. They spent their days tending to the land, enjoying the quiet peace of the cabin. But one morning, as they stood together by the fence looking out at the animals grazing nearby, Jake turned to Kaya, a thought forming in his mind. "Kaya, what do you think about staying here? For good?" he asked, his voice uncertain but hopeful. "You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to go back to the life you had. You can stay here. With me, we can build something together. A real life." Kaya looked at him, her expression soft. For a moment she didn't say anything. She just stood there, as if considering his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I think I'd like that," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." Jake smiled, relief flooding through him. He had spent so much time thinking about what it would mean to offer Kaya a future, but now, hearing her say it, it felt real. They had both found something worth holding on to, something that could last. And so, they began to build their life together. With each passing day, the cabin felt more like a home, and the land around it more like a sanctuary. Kaya's healing continued, and Jake found himself caring more deeply for her than he ever thought he could. They worked side by side, building a future, one day at a time, knowing that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. The cabin, once just a solitary place of refuge, had become a home filled with hope, promise, and love. And as the sun set each evening, casting long shadows over the land they had come to cherish, Jake and Kaya knew that they had found something they had both been searching for, something worth fighting for. They were no longer alone.